Thank you for being here for the book launch for Lives Revised, Assia Wevill, Ted Hughes, and Sylvia Plath. I'm Julie Goodspeed-Chadwick. I'd like to thank LSU Press for all of its efforts on behalf of this book and for hosting this launch. I have been asked to give a 30-minute formal presentation about the book. And as a special treat, I have put together a slideshow of curated archival images related to Assia. And you'll note that I will oftentimes refer to her by her first name because she assumed various surnames in her lifetime. And so that slideshow will run during the formal presentation, and each slide is timed at about 2 minutes per image. And you'll note that the images are primarily of Assia because those photographs and documents are quite rare and less accessible than photographs of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. So I will begin sharing my screen and we'll start the slideshow. Okay. This is a book about trauma. Everyone suffers. What brought me to this study was a realization that the basic narrative was not only threadbare, but it was not quite right. In fact, the master narratives we have concerning Assia Wevill, Ted Hughes, and Sylvia Plath have historically had missing pieces and details, and that is why we always have new biographies and need them. Important work grounded in feminist recovery efforts have affected change, but the received basic narrative outside of these recovery efforts is often also false and ideologically motivated. We would do well to ask, what are the values underpinning the basic biographical and literary narratives of our subjects? Whom and what do those values and the default narrative serve? Biography rivets us. It fascinates us because it teaches us about our world then and now. As I argue in Lives Revised, biography offers us figurative mirrors and measuring sticks. And these allow us to determine where we are, how far we have come, and how far we still have to go. It's important to note that biography may never be able to get this story entirely right. As new information emerges, we revise accordingly. For this book, I had the privilege of accessing newly opened archival materials at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and the British Library in London, England, as well as artifacts held in private hands. And what was underscored for me in studying newly recovered or accessible letters, notes, audio and video recordings, memoirs, and the like, is that Assia Wevill's life and Ted Hughes's life are so enmeshed as to be inextricable. The impact they had on each other is great. The values and understanding that I brought to this book were those that attracted me to scholarly study of Assia Wevill and Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes in the first place. Trauma studies and feminist recovery are part and parcel of my work on these three writers. And here's why. From my perspective, this project, this scholarship matters because trauma is a social justice issue that affects people across identity categories and that perhaps affects us all given our community affiliations in some measure. Trauma is a psychological and emotional injury, that which cannot be repressed indefinitely and which animates a person's thoughts and behavior. I emphasize the gender dimensions of traumatic experiences when applicable, especially in part 2 of the book, titled Their Lives and Their Words. The book is set up to provide an introduction to the approach, and that approach focuses on how we construct and consume life stories. It also presents biographical material, and then it moves into an analysis and discussion of people who knew Assia, Hughes, and Plath, synthesizing almost 100 interviews. Then it considers the impact of trauma on the biographical story of Assia Wevill's life before investigating the traumatic influence of Assia's, Shura's, and Plath's deaths on Hughes's life and work. The book closes reflecting on reception, how we come to understand biographical stories at the intersections of trauma, gender, and authorship. In editing, researching, and contextualizing Plath's letters, Peter K. Steinberg and Karen V. Kukil make new stories about Plath possible in making new texts and scholarship public. They rely on Plath's words, not editing her into their version of Sylvia Plath. These examples have proved to be deeply influential for this book. Also important is feminist recovery work. And this is the impulse that motivates all of my books and most of my work. And so as Melanie Mercier argues, biographical work is the result of analysis because biography requires interpretation. As Mercier maintains, biography was and is the generic terrain on which women battle for their inclusion in history. Reclaiming Assia Wevill and the collected writings of Assia Wevill paved the way for Lives Revised. In fact, this book could not have been written without the research that went into those books. This work is important because Assia continues to be polarizing for concerning reasons, as we will touch upon in this presentation. So I want to introduce the concept of positionality. And this is where someone stands in relation to the subject in an interview. The cultural, social, and historical context matter in biography and in the real world. Assia is not an archetype. She is not a femme fatale. Indeed, throughout interviews concerning Assia, Plath, and Hughes, we receive multiple takes on the same person. And I'm going to read a selection from the introduction. I'm going to turn to page 11 so that we can see positionality illustrated. What may not have been conveyed in earlier work on Assia, she was remembered by a friend as cheerful and fun, not exactly what we associate with her stereotype. Acknowledging Assia's beauty, her friend remarks that everyone noticed Assia in a room. She attracted attention. Despite the attention, which may have opened up opportunities to discuss Plath, she did not talk about Plath to everyone. This unnamed friend never heard Assia speak about her. Summing up her friend, the interviewee asserts, Assia was an intelligent person, not emotional. The friend goes on to state that everyone assumed Shura was Hughes's daughter with Assia, and that emotional harmony, rather than sexual chemistry, would be the reason that Assia would have been attracted to Hughes. Even in this interview, one in which Assia's personality is delineated, the interviewer presses the interviewee about Assia's sex life. Archetypes and stereotypes are difficult to dismiss or thwart. And so there is a more perfect example with an interview with Elizabeth Compton Sigmund and Eleanor Klein, who were both friends of Plath. Declaring Assia a witch with a terrible capacity for destruction, Sigmund elaborates on her take. Plath was frightened of Assia, of her alleged barrenness, abortions, hysterical emotions, and feline smell. This association with the animalistic, the not human specifically, leaves Assia in a space in which she can be attacked and scapegoated as that which is not deserving of the full breadth of her humanity. Sigmund's positionality with respect to Assia informs her opinions. Just before intimating that Assia is less human than Plath, Sigmund sketches a scenario that features her vulnerable friend. Forced into the competitive literary market, Plath felt very threatened and discussed literary wars with Sigmund, metaphorical battles in which everyone shot at her, and in Sigmund's words, every arrow went through. The memory of this scenario would be one that would cause Sigmund to rally to her friend's defense, if only in memory of her, and Assia, already positioned as a scapegoat, receives the brunt of the anger and dislike surely meant for Plath's attackers. a world hostile to women, in which women are socialized to dislike and compete against each other, features in Eleanor Klein's conversation with Rosenstein about who Assia was. Was she a competitive woman, wondered Klein, after Rosenstein expresses her incredulity that Assia would move into Plath's flat with Hughes after Plath died. If nothing else, she betrayed Plath as a pretend friend, concludes Klein, a notion to which Rosenstein verbally assents, notwithstanding that Hughes tendered the invitation to live with him and that Assia assumed the role of caretaker of his children with Plath when no other suitable caretaker could be secured. In many respects, the discussions that occur in this book are long overdue. It may seem impossible to fathom that Sigmund could say to Hughes at one point, everyone knows about Assia, everyone knows everything because you're so public about it. In 2001, Feinstein drew a comparison between the famous Plath and the infamous Assia, because if the latter happened to be recognized at all, it was for being bad. Feinstein observes, Assia presented in some ways as fragmented and vulnerable a human being as Sylvia Plath. Very little has been written about Assia, partly because Ted discouraged it. One of Assia's co-workers remarks in 1987, and there was no love lost. Almost 2 decades after Assia died, she wrote, and how amazing it is that none of this has been publicly aired. She continues, Ted and his friends seem to have chosen to save the public from the undoubted risk of making too harsh a judgment of him, even if in so doing, his dead wife's reputation is cruelly distorted. I would add that Assia's reputation was distorted and fabricated too. She became a sort of caricature or archetype. The inducement to secrecy must be attributed in part to the traumatic events Hughes endured. Trauma marred Hughes's life and his ability to find his equilibrium and restore safety and community while telling his trauma story through his poetry sequences Capriccio in 1990 and Birthday Letters in 1998 constitute great feats of working toward healing, even if healing is an elusive and a recursive process. The aftermath of the suicides of Plath and Assia, combined with the death of his daughter Shura, was almost more than Hughes could bear. For that reason, and to salvage his reputation in the aftermath of Plath's suicide, Hughes managed to keep quiet about Assia, except in personal writing and in poems or notes that were never published or that were so oblique as to keep secrets buried or obscured. And it's those notes and that writing that I was able to access for this book. So the purpose of this book is to enlarge the scope of how we think and talk about Assia and Hughes, and to consider why their biographical stories mean so much to us now, as well as to relate new biographical stories offering new details and facts about Assia, Hughes, and Plath. Again, this is nothing if not a trauma story for all three subjects. In the introduction, we encounter an interview by Rosenstein, who at that time was gathering materials for a Plath biography. And an unnamed woman acquainted with Assia, who is the interviewee, declared, to understand Sylvia, one must understand Assia. Suzette Macedo, a friend of both Plath and Assia, maintains that Plath recognized Assia as her alter ego, as well as the other woman. Assia and Plath's contemporaries engaged in comparisons habitually. Typically, the women were played off of each other, turning them into literary foils. For example, Leonard Baskin asserts that Assia was the complete opposite of Sylvia. Making them, though, into a literary convention had the effect of simplifying their complexity and humanity and pitted in a reductive fashion Golden Girl Plath versus femme fatale Assia. Both women were accomplished writers. They were engaging, creative, strong, and beautiful women, and essentially single mothers who had battled trauma and thought of themselves and were described as friends as rootless. And yet, Conventional logic, as informed by binaries, stipulates that we must have a bad actor to prove the goodness of the other actor in an equation. Thus, for decades now, we pit Plath against Assia. Our admiration or love for Plath dictates, per a binary formula, that we must distance Assia from her, making the latter the repository of everything Plath was not. So there are two takeaways from the introduction, and I wanted to sketch the approach of the book and some of the main theoretical concepts, because I'm going to read select passages from the Assia chapter and the Hughes chapter, and those capture the storytelling of the book. But the two takeaways from the introduction: one, Assia is a victim, and this book explores the context of the forces Assia did not understand and could not control. Her story is one that reveals the power, limitations, and enticements of gender, in addition to the punishments we dole out to women who are too beautiful, too successful, and too bold for our liking. The second takeaway: all biographical writing involves distancing, partial information, and lenses that we impose to make sense of lives that are not our own. Why does biography resonate with readers? Mary Catherine Bateson claims, women today read and write biographies to gain perspective on their own lives. That claim, I would venture to say, rests on the understanding that women's lives have something to teach us first and foremost. Bateson also avers, we need to look at multiple lives to test and shape our own. And so I had a literary shock, as Ted Hughes would say, when I discovered Assia Wevill, whose own life had been circumscribed by gendered constraints and lack of support, whose own horizons must have felt smaller than those of her male counterparts, and who does not get a pass because we love to hate unacceptable women, to use Audre Lorde's words. And so that shock led me to bolster feminist recovery efforts related to Assia and Plath as much as I could, and allowing for a reassessment of Hughes. The book so Lives Revised deals with ghostly presences, because audio recordings, interviews, memoirs, and photographs create the illusion of vibrant, alive people, contributing in significant ways to the world and leading their lives as best they could in numerous challenging circumstances, and not least, leaving us with stories we can learn from and build on in our interpretations of lives, in our classrooms, and in our discussions of writing and values. Filling in the record as best we can enables us to better approach lives in literature that are grounded in and indebted to biographies, lives really lived. So from here, I'm going to read some choice passages from the book. So I wanted to open quickly with, to preface the Assia chapter with this, because this is an interview that stuck with me throughout the duration of the reading and the researching and the writing of this book. It's an interview with Edward Lucy Smith. And in the interview, it's an amusing interview, but there was a sentence he uttered that I think is very true to this day. And so he believed that Plath did not trust him because he was close to Assia. They were good friends and they were coworkers. And Plath saw him as Assia's ally. And it will be clear why Plath would not have trusted Lucy Smith, given his comments about her in his early 1970s interview with Harriet Rosenstein. So for his part, Lucy Smith says he could not like Plath either. He admired her, but that was something different. He says, seemingly, if one liked Assia and Hughes, it was impossible to like Plath too. According to Lucy Smith, quote, you couldn't like all three, end quote. Okay. This is from the Assia chapter. It is unsettling to come across the dominant view of Assia captured by Rosenstein as she sums up Assia's portrait in the last decade of her life. Assia became, quote, sadder and hugely fat, end quote. The verbal portrait Rosenstein sketches for us is meant to dismiss and denigrate Assia as letting herself go physically and wanting too much in terms of lifestyle. She fails at making herself a pretty object and in not being content with a gender circumscribed lot in life. We are to infer from such statements, and that was just one statement from a series in an interview, that we would like Assia better and she would be happier if she were more decorative and less ambitious. Such women can never be agents of their own lives or truly powerful. And if they are actively living their lives and accomplishing great things in a man's world, as Plath did, they are tagged a, quote, greedy, competitive woman, end quote, as Rosenstein classifies Plath. Okay. As noted throughout this study, there are competing interpretations of Plath and Assia, and they emerge from a variety of sources. For example, with respect to Plath, Alan Jenkins, who lived in Bellstone, close to where Plath went horseback riding, believes that Plath was a country person. See what happened in London with her suicide, he argues. She loved Ireland and the English countryside. Of course, she enjoyed the country in every way, he says. She kept bees, and Nan Jenkins lent Plath a smock for her beekeeping. Alan Jenkins's account is in direct contrast to Avery's portrayal of Plath as a city girl who could not assimilate to life in Devon. And in contrast to the posthumous stereotype of Plath as a depressed person obsessed with death, Alan Jenkins affirms she was a very gay and happy person, but who wouldn't be affected by being left with two small children? She did feel the circumstances very much. The idea of Plath being in love with death is bunk, Jenkins declares. Plath's relocation to London proved disastrous, Jenkins counters, because she was even lonelier there than she had been in North Taunton. Marcia Stern, a friend of Plath, echoes in a different interview that she only encountered Plath depressed in connection with ill health. Eleanor Klein, who met Plath at Smith College, describes Plath as totally lovely. Asserts Klein, I never felt I was talking to a doomed person. These friends of Plath are exceptions to the master narrative, the older master narrative. On the whole, Rosenstein observes people only remember and write about the morbid things about Plath, ignoring what is positive. I would add that tends to be true about Assia as well. So if Plath, the proverbial golden girl, as Clarissa Roche calls her in a November 1973 interview, and academia's darling, as Paul Roche dubs her in an interview from November 21st, 1973, if she cannot escape getting metaphorically cut down, then Assia has no hope. When Roche and Rosenstein debate whether, in Rosenstein's choice words, Plath was indeed an, quote, awful frigid bitch, end quote, or whether Assia was a, quote, hot-blooded, warm-blooded, sexy babe, end quote, they mark the false dichotomy between these two women and gesture to the trap encountered by successful, attractive, ambitious women. Okay, this is from a section about Ted Hughes. Since Assia and Shura had died, Hughes had been trying to piece together his broken life. There exists no more fitting metaphor or language for trauma than that which refers to a life as fragmented and in shattered and broken pieces. Certainly, Hughes could not be understood to be healed and whole. His traumatic responses to Plath's death would have shown Hughes how unsafe and, in fact, dangerous the world is. People who suffer from trauma come to view the world differently because they know firsthand how precarious existence can be. In the weeks after Plath's death, Hughes confided to friends, "That's the end of my life. The rest is posthumous." Even more revealing with respect to Assia and Shura are the lines Hughes composed around May 1969, about 2 months, give or take, after his partner and daughter died. Writes Hughes in a draft of poetic lines, "I don't compose for a reader. What strangers' momentary pleasure will pay me for ruining my life and causing the deaths of those I have loved best and who loved me best and who were my life." He continues, "I am not composing poetry. I am trying to get out of the flames. One of the common paradigms in trauma studies is the three-prong approach or pathway toward healing, as articulated by Judith Herman, which encompasses telling the trauma story, along with establishing safety and reestablishing connections between victims or survivors and their communities. Securing a safe place is an important part of it, and Hughes must have felt safety was elusive in the 1960s as the trauma of Plath's suicide, Assia's suicide, and Shura's killing confronted him unexpectedly. Kathy Carruth theorizes that what makes an event especially traumatic is believing that one is alive only by accident. And a remorseful and trauma-stricken Hughes pens those lines about being metaphorically burned by flames in response to the loss of Assia and Shura. In a private notebook, never meant to be published, Hughes reveals he suffers symptoms of trauma, recurring nightmares every night. Assia has not yet died in these nightmares, and her death is preventable and a result of a misunderstanding, thereby rendering what happens an accident. A separate blue-gray exercise book at Emory University, which was newly acquired, and I got to be the first person to read it and work on it, captures Hughes's diverse memories of Assia and Shura across years. The memories take the form of jottings, often unfinished and unpolished, with most quite elliptical, as these would make sense to Hughes, but exist without much context for other readers. In one of the early entries in the book, Hughes remembers what may have constituted his last visit to Assia in Clapham, including her bitterness and resignation to what Hughes said or what she thought he meant. Not surprisingly, Assia's Dior perfume makes the list as a memory. Also making the list is Hughes's pursuit of freedom. He references Plath writing that liberating himself from her meant freeing himself from burden and tyranny. However, he counters that line of thinking by then asserting that he came around to viewing Plath and Susan Alliston as the means of escape from Assia, whom he was trying to evade, he admits in 1962, because he suspects that she takes up with other men. Her image at that time also dominates him, and he knows that Assia struggled with her self-confidence when it came to her body. Unsure about Assia's motives early on in their relationship, Hughes wonders whether she felt a competitiveness with Plath, rendering Hughes a prize of sorts. They do talk of Plath's poems, Hughes reveals, when everything in his life still felt redeemable to him, meaning Plath is presumably still alive. In documenting his memories, Hughes records what is meaningful to him, and among these is a night of sex with Assia, replete with details about a memorable dress and strawberries. The sex, which Hughes calls endless love, lasted until 2 a.m. and did result in a broken sink. At this point in their affair, Hughes admits they could have broken up, but he could not stand losing Assia and did not want to be a coward who withdraws. Basically, he wanted to smash his way out of his life in North Taunton. A very short paragraph covers the news of Plath's suicide and the timeline of it from Hughes's perspective. He spent the night with another girlfriend, Susan Alliston, before returning home in the snow and receiving the call about Plath's death. He recalls sitting with Assia afterward, and the moment was fatal, a fatality, he calls it, for Assia. After Shura is born, Hughes recollects Assia pushing the baby carriage and investing great effort in setting up a home for Shura and herself in Clapham after leaving Highbury. Even in Ireland, where she was happiest with Hughes, Assia was desolate when Hughes stayed overnight in Dublin, leaving her and Shura and Frida and Nicholas Hughes in Connemara. Significantly, Hughes directs our attention to the great gaps in his memories and in his writing. He is confounded by them, but gaps are a hallmark of trauma in writing and in storytelling. We should expect them in Hughes's memories about Assia and Shura. So this is coming from the British Library. As for Assia, Hughes likens her to Ophelia and himself to Hamlet, noting that Hamlet's madness kills Ophelia. He faults himself for his folly, stupidity, greed, and conceit, all that he could not own up to or confront with respect to Assia. Hughes also lists Plath's ghost and having to live with it in his Assia notes. In a draft of a short poem written in what looks to be an agitated hand and a breakneck pace, Hughes contemplates Assia 24 years after she has died. He still thinks about her and assumes she would be a beauty on the cusp of seniority. He wonders about the meaning of her life, what its purpose was, although this line of thinking is couched as a question. Disturbingly, the collection of archived papers in the A box closes with a handwritten and slightly messy poem titled Ashes, in which Hughes details the ashes that are Assia. He even calls her Ashes, and Shura, referred to as an ashen child, and how he kept Assia's ashes in a casket on a bookshelf in his bedroom. Assia's life as a refugee from Nazi Germany was only a reprieve from death, Hughes concludes. We can learn a lot about biography, mid-century literary culture in London, Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, Yehuda Amichai, and 20th century literature being written and translated in England in the 1960s through study of Assia's life and contributions. We also learn about the traumatic wound, what it entails, and how people may respond. Bessel A. van der Kolk and Alexander C. McFarlane imply that the study of trauma is important because of its universality. Experiencing trauma is an essential part of being human, they write. Hence the preoccupation with literature that treats how people cope with the inevitable tragedies of life. In short, they posit, the study of trauma confronts one with the best and worst in human nature and is bound to provoke a range of intense personal reactions in the people involved. Moreover, we know that surfaces can be deceiving, and the acts of reconstructing and reinterpreting lives reflect our own values and approaches in the 21st century. Feminist recovery work often responds to or is initiated by symbolic violence that stems from bias, discrimination, and oppression, often figured as absence or misrepresentations in literary studies. Such work aims to counter oppression and violence. I took up this project with the hope of more firmly establishing new and reframing old narratives, especially in connection with Assia Wevill, whom I view as a victim in a tragedy with many victims. For it is too simplistic to cast Assia as the foil to Plath and to pit them against each other. Assia is more than the cold, destructive, unnatural, and beautiful woman Plath characterized her as, and she is more than the persecuted, dangerous, desirable, destructive, and demonic force Hughes portrayed her as. She is not like Lady Lazarus. She is not a vigilante, though the femme fatale script has been pinned to her. In her actual life, she was driven toward and motivated by love, security, and maybe admiration. Feminist recovery is a critical enterprise that endeavors to recover and recuperate significant women writers and their work that has been forgotten, or lives that have been erased because of complicated gendered politics and imbalances of power. This is not to say that Assia's life and work are significant only because we are dealing with a woman, although women's lives and contributions have uniquely shaped literature, history, culture, and society that are, to this day and today, widely unacknowledged and sometimes contested. We can learn from biographies of Assia Wevill, Ted Hughes, and Sylvia Plath, told and retold. These stories show us ourselves and the world in which we live, then and now. And that concludes the formal portion of the launch. I will stop sharing my screen. And I think we're ready. I think we have time for questions.
Yeah, we do. And thank you so much, Julie, for that wonderful presentation. I learned so much. And like others, I'm really inspired by this feminist project of revisiting Assia Wevill. I mean, I'm thinking about the idea of how villains, especially women, are often more illuminating about a culture than a person. And kind of along those lines, there is a question in the chat from Suzanne Walker, who is wondering, are there other women who you'd like to see a new biography of?
Oh, this is such a great question. And congratulations to Suzanne on her new job at the Library of Congress. Suzanne is someone I know. She's wonderful. So yes, I mean, there are a host of writers who deserve treatment and I think are revisiting. So I actually applied to go on a sabbatical to work at the Library of Congress, because there is a female poet, a multiracial female poet that I have been keen to work on, and her life and her work have been neglected. I think in part because she writes about trauma, and that can be an unsavory topic. However, she won the National Book Award. I mean, and so when your work is recognized with such a prestigious prize, and when your life is so interesting, and at the end of her life she started to write about it, there's a lot that we can learn from lives and literature. And I think in tandem, how much richer the story then is, the biographical story, that sometimes intertextually weaves into the literary work. So it's taken me a long time to actually get into biography, because I was trained, not to necessarily work like in biographical studies. I was trained as a modernist who worked on texts rather than lives. But I think our fascination with lives has prompted really excellent work in modernist studies and in contemporary work. So there's so much to be done, and there's so much that remains in terms of working on women writers. And so I have one in mind. I don't want to say too much because I haven't actually begun this project yet, so I don't want to overpromise. But I have another subject that I hope to work on, and I don't know if now is the time to talk about future work. I can wait until the end of the question portion to talk about that. But Peter K. Steinberg and I are also up to something exciting as well in terms of archival work and new work.
Yeah, we'd love to hear about it.
Okay, well, I'm excited to share. So I think Peter might be attending the launch, but I want to say that he and I will soon have access to newly recovered texts by Assia. So I'm being a little bit ambiguous on purpose. So we're excited to see these new texts. It is something that I have been waiting to see, I mean, for over, I don't know, a dozen years at this point. And so these texts are extant. And in the near future, we will have access to them, and they may very well result in a new, revised, updated, expanded version of the collected writings of Assia Wevill, which I had the honor of co-editing with Peter. So we're excited to see these texts, which we believe, we suspect will be very important.
I really love the idea of the biography as this like constantly reframed and revised set of ideas. And I was inspired by how you mentioned how biographies and people can show us ourselves in the world we live in. And I'm kind of curious if you think that changes maybe how we should think about biography as a genre, right? Like, you know what I mean? That if it's something that's constantly changing, is there a different way that we should think about it or that you approach it?
Yeah, so I remember attending the 2012 Plath Symposium at IU Bloomington. And I remember I got to be a plenary speaker, and I was giving a presentation of trauma in the aerial poems, which ended up becoming an article that I ended up placing. But I remember that clearly because I was very firm in that my piece was not biographical, that it was a trauma informed literary analysis and discussion of trauma and how it permeated Ariel. And so I like afterward, I attended wonderful sessions about biography at that symposium. And I remember asking myself, why do I have to have this clear divide? Why do I have to kind of bifurcate the life and the work? Now, of course, you don't want to just take the life and just sort of, slapdash put it onto a work. But of course, the work is coming out of various contexts, and biography is one of those. And so I think with someone like Sylvia Plath, work, books, research on Plath is always ongoing. And in fact, Plath, like some other writers, is an industry. And so it's fascinating to me that we continue to have new important work that emerges on Sylvia Plath. And in fact, I am editing with Janet Badia and Emily Van Dyne, the Rutledge Companion to Sylvia Plath. And I'm excited about that project and also impressed by all of the new approaches that people have to Sylvia Plath, biography and otherwise. And so there are ways in which people are learning about her life in the archive or from a collection of biographies, or maybe the literary work or the journals or the letters are prompting them then to read other texts and to start putting together more pieces into like a bigger jigsaw puzzle in terms of what we can know and how we might revisit and reframe close readings, literary interpretations, interpretations of lives. That took me a long time to understand that actually biography is really an interpretive exercise and a skill just in the way that close reading and literary interpretation is. And so, I'm really impressed by what I know that other people are doing in Plath studies. And there are two other edited collections of Plath coming out. There's one that will be published by Cambridge University Press that Dorca Tomas is editing. And there is another one being proposed. I don't know if I should say too much about that, but by Heather Clark. So I'll just say by Heather Clark and Amanda Golden. And so there are really wonderful books in the works, and there will continue to be scholarship and creative work, and influenced and informed by Plath biographies and Plath studies.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to sort of pivot and get to some comments and questions from the chat now. First, just a couple comments. This one is from Angel Sulzer, who says, love this work. I can think of some female artists today who may be undergoing similar treatment that Assia experienced in her life and career, which is something that maybe you spoke towards a little bit earlier.
Yeah. Oh, well, so I actually know Angel too. She's really quite brilliant. So I thank her. I thank her for that comment. I mean, to me, it's so startling in 2025 that these are the conversations that we need to have. And if we need to have these conversations about women who have maybe so much going for them, and in some ways, then what does it mean when we have a subject who has even more vulnerabilities, who's less protected? And so, yeah, thank you for those comments.
All right, so we've got a string of questions here from the chat. So I'm going to start with Wendy Cartwright, who asks, you quoted Hughes, who wrote that he caused the deaths. What do you make of the need to follow the binary script, even by women, to pit Assia against Plath? And do you think this will ever change?
Thank you, Wendy. That's so great, so insightful. I have had the honor to work on 3 books related to Assia. And so and each time I have new information, there are always new papers, new documents, new stories, new things that emerge with respect to Assia Plath and Hughes. And so I think in that sense, we're always going to have more fuel like for this conversation. And also because there are very strong gendered binaries that circulate in birthday letters and Capriccio, Ted Hughes's poetry sequences about Plath and Assia, respectively. And I mean, those, in my opinion, those are really, they're really amazing poetry collections, but they're really fraught and problematic too, in terms of thinking about gendered binaries. And so I would argue it behooves us to teach them and to unpack them so we understand what we're consuming. At the same time, those 2 poetry collections teach us quite a lot about trauma as well. And so I think that's also why they have a special place in my heart, because I think they're really important in terms of what they illustrate. But as for gendered binaries, I like to think one day they'll be sort of dismantled, and there'll be so many other stories and so many other possibilities and so many other kinds of myths that we tell about women in literature and culture, that we won't just have these like 2, these kind of 2 default ones that that Plath and Assia represent. And so I mean that's my hope. I kind of I'm surprised at how often I encounter them like in the work that I'm teaching on a daily basis, or the things that I read, or what I myself am writing about or working on. And so I think that's the hope. I hope that at some point, we'll move past that, and there'll just be a plethora of images and possibilities for everyone, for all subjects.
This question's from Diane, and you touched on this a little bit, but Diane asks, how do you guide your students in reading people like Wevill, Plath, and Hughes who write well but behave badly?
Such a great question. I think it's so I it might this might be actually someone that I acknowledge in Lives Revised in the acknowledgments. So it might be the same Diane, but and so if that's the case, she's also a professor, and so it's sort of impossible to teach a survey course and not have authors who have behaved badly. I mean, so and I think, especially with Assia Wevill, what's interesting about teaching her, and I really have only had maybe a handful of opportunities. I taught a Sylvia Plath studies seminar. I've taught some women's studies capstones and some independent studies in which we read Assia's work. And so, but the students who are in those classes are interested in Plath. And so because they're curious, they want to know more about Plath, they want to know more about people in her circle, perhaps they're sort of predisposed to care about women's lives, to care about women's work. And so too, I mean, the story is a tragedy. I mean, several people describe it as a Greek tragedy. The only person left standing is Ted Hughes at the end. And so I think there is kind of a hook in terms of kind of fascination with abomination. And it is sensational. I mean, there are really quite sensational primary texts, and you can't really shy away from it in terms of biographical work either. And so I think people want to understand what's horrible, and they're curious as to how this kind of ugly, messy, violent situation could even come about. And so I think there's that interest in trying to solve it or to figure it out. Like when I'm teaching about biography or working with lives, but I certainly don't have it, all figured out. And so I think part of teaching difficult lives, or people who behave badly, I like that, is making sure that the interpretations that you construct, the stories that you spin, are all grounded in various kinds of text that you can substantiate what you're saying. And so I think that's all I've got to say about that at the moment. But thank you for that question.
That's a great answer, Julie. And I apologize for not saying the last name. I didn't want to get it wrong, but it's Prenat or Prenat.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah. She's
Um,
amazing, so thank you. She is a biographer, so she could probably address that question just as well or better than I.
this one is from Lori Montalbano, who asks, do you see parallels between the variations in biographical between autobiographical texts? Excuse me, I cannot say that word, and I can repeat that question if you'd like.
So I'm sorry, do I see connections among autobiographical and
Variations and
biographical
right,
text?
exactly. That's
Oh
how I
gosh, that's
understand
such a
that
good
question.
question. Okay, well, Lori and I should talk and figure out how we're going to start a new book project. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in life writing and how people want to represent themselves. And I think it comes out of literary studies, right? Like with characterization, it's not only what a character thinks, says, and does. It's also how other characters interact with that character and what they say about the character as well, right? So it's kind of this like 360 perspective. And so that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the 360. I think memoirs are even more fascinating than biographies, even though I love biographies. And I think they're terribly exciting. I do think they show us our world. And I think people like them so much because of the mirrors and the measuring sticks, metaphors that I invoked. But I mean, I think when somebody is writing their own life story, I think that's especially fascinating. Like, what do they choose to represent? Like, what are they leaving out? Like, what do they deem to be important? And so I think that's really resonant and exciting too. And especially if you are combining those two, projects like autobiographical texts and biographical ones, and seeing what emerges, out of that. I mean, I think it's a big endeavor. It's a big kind of project, but that's the kind of project that I like. I like the 360 view rather than the sort of like flat, static, linear narrative. Maybe because it's more playful, but I think it's even though it's often more ambitious, it's more robust and it's richer too.
All right. So I got two kind of ideas that I kind of want to thread together and one more question for you. Um, at first I was thinking about that Audre Lorde quote that you mentioned, "We love to hate unacceptable women."
Hmm.
And and I was also thinking about something that we kind of discussed a bit before the presentation, which was this idea that we used to think of writers like Plath as contemporary, but now we think of them in terms of modernism. And so I guess I'm thinking about what you were talking about, the feminist recovery work and its value. And I guess I'm just interested in kind of like how have our expectations, like what we expect from like writers like Assia and Plath changed, and maybe how haven't they changed?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a big question. So maybe people and people in the chat can also respond as they like in terms of their observations. Um, so I also like Audre Lorde's stance that the master's tools can never dismantle the master's house. And that's a radical feminist perspective, right? That you have to kind of blow up the system, or you have to work outside of the system to make change, to affect change, to make things happen. But Audre Lorde was also interested in possibilities. And she has that really lovely essay in which she argues that poetry is not a luxury, that we absolutely need poetry so that we can imagine, possibilities. And so I think feminist recovery work just does just that. Like it's so feminist recovery work, and there's so many Plath people doing feminist recovery work. That's just really exciting. And so I think when you have that work published and it's accessible, then it allows the next person to build on that. And so one of the things I wanted to do with Lives Revised, I had the opportunity, to work at Emory multiple times, and to get to work in the British Library and to get to work with all of these treasures that they have. And I thought how wonderful it'd be to take what I think are the gems, the pieces that we don't know or that hasn't been fixed in print yet, and to make those available for people who want to write creatively or critically, and so that they have material that they can cite, that they don't have to, I don't know, dig through folders and read hundreds of pages of handwritten papers in a box, to find the nugget of information that they want. And so I tried to tell a story with all of these pieces that I found to be rich and fascinating, building on the earlier Assia books, so that it would change the story of Assia that has been the sort of default and master narrative that we actually still have. I mean, you still see it in places like online, and sometimes it makes its way into reviews and books and things. I mean, but I do think the conversation is changing. I do think the tides are turning. I mean, now that we have all of this workout, I don't think it'll ever go back to, to what it was before. So I think that's exciting. But whenever you make any kind of progress or any kind of inroads, I mean, this is sort of the one of the basic tenets in Introduction to Women's Studies, is that whenever you make progress, there's always like a backlash and you get kind of pushed back, but hopefully it's not all the way back to the start, right? And so I feel most fortunate to be alive in this day and age where I have been able to read all of the wonderful work that others have published and that I've been able to cite, and to live at a time when we have all of these exciting biographers and scholars doing wonderful things. Because I do think the more people who are able to um, publish or disseminate or have conversations about these really new, exciting stories and lives and versions of kind of old tales that don't really hold up and that are pretty threadbare and aren't actually really that interesting, the more exciting like future work is going to be as well, because it will be richer and there'll be so much more behind it.
We're gonna end this great presentation with a couple comments, and then just give you a moment to sign us off if you'd like. So I wanted to mention some comments from Janet and Marcia, who both gave you some congratulations. Janet said the book is fantastic. Your presentation was outstanding. Marcia said they could listen to you talk about your research and teaching all day long, and congrats on the latest book. We
Well,
also
thank you.
have one other comment from Suzanne, and Suzanne says, I'd love Taylor Swift to read this book and then create an album inspired by it. So I wanted to
Okay,
end us
well,
on that note.
well, I will say so. I actually really like Tori Amos. Actually, I love Tori Amos, and so I got to go to it wasn't a meet and greet because she wasn't there, but her tour manager appeared before her concert in Indianapolis. I guess it was maybe like 2 years ago, and I brought a copy of the collected writings of Assia Wevill and gave it to the tour manager to give to Tori Amos. So who knows? Maybe Assia will find her way into song lyrics. I don't know.
I'm obsessed with this as an origin story for a future album. That would be great. Yeah, anything else for us, Julie, before we sign off?
Well, so I do want to say that I thought maybe this was going to be the last book I had, because I only want to write books about Assia when I have a lot to say and when I think that there's something important to contribute. However, I do think that there could be a new edition of the collected writings of Assia Wevill on the horizon. So I think that's exciting. There are new books coming out about Plath. That's exciting. And so this isn't the end of it all. So thank you. Thank you for allowing me this time to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to thank everyone as well for spending this afternoon with us. Um, Thank you, Julie, for this wonderful presentation. And just a reminder, we do have a link in the chat for 40% off Julie's book. So make sure to check that out. And yeah, I'll see everyone next time for our next reading. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.